The wind does not sleep here. It gnaws at the mountains like a hungry god, whispering names long forgotten, names carved into stone so they would never be. Welcome to a place where grief is not buried with the dead, but worn like a second skin. In this remote highland village, where time crawls and shadows stretch too far, there lingers a ritual lost to history and damned by faith. They call it the skin prayer, an outlawed rite whispered about in fevered hush, too terrible to be written, too sacred to be erased. A rite where the body is peeled away from the soul, where a name is offered not on the tongue, but through the flesh. They believed sorrow could be extracted, like poison from a wound. But what if pain is not something you remove? What if it's something that waits to be passed on? Tonight, we follow the story of a mother who dared to speak to the old gods and discovered the price of being heard. Stay close. The wind knows your name now.
They say the wind in the highlands has a voice. Not a howl, not a whistle, but a voice. It murmurs through the crevices of the cliffs and the bones of the trees, curling between stones carved with names too old for memory. In the village of Drawlin, names are sacred. You are not born until your name is carved into stone, and you are not dead until it is carved again beneath a second date. Every home has its own slab, a gray piece of mountain stone kept by the hearth, etched with the names of those who have lived and those who have left. To speak a name aloud is to stir the soul. To forget a name is to invite it back. No one forgets names in Drawlin, at least not until Ansa's child died. He was a quiet boy, Ilro, with hair like wheat and hands always curled into fists as though he came into the world ready to hold on. He had just turned 8. One morning, he woke with a fever. By dusk, he was gone. There was no explanation, no spread of illness, no signs of poison. Just a mother's scream breaking through the fog and the boy's name etched into stone far too soon. Ansa didn't cry at the funeral. She didn't scream again. She simply stood behind the altar stone, staring down at her son's name as if trying to memorize each curve of each letter, as if she could trap his soul there if she stared long enough. The villagers gave her space. That was their way. Grief was considered private, even sacred. They left bowls of food by her door. They whispered prayers as they passed her shuttered windows. But no one knocked. No one dared speak to her. Because they remembered something. Something old, something almost forgotten. There's a saying in Drawlin, passed down like a warning. The ones who lose the most are the ones the gods watch most closely. Ansa's mother, Mirith, was one of the oldest women in the village, her eyes clouded with time, her voice thin as parchment. She was the only one who entered Ansa's home during the mourning weeks. She did not embrace her daughter. She did not speak his name. Instead, she lit a fire, placed a bowl of mountain salt on the floor, and drew a symbol in ash beside the hearth, a shape like an open eye inside a circle of thorns. Ansa watched her from the shadows. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. Mirith didn't look up. "Protection," she whispered, "from the old gods, from what they still want." Ansa almost laughed, almost. "There are no gods," she said, her voice hard. "There was no one to save him." Mirith looked up now, her clouded eyes wet with something older than tears. "No," she said softly, "but there are still deals." Ansa didn't ask what she meant. She didn't have to. Because in her dreams that night, she saw Ilro standing at the edge of the altar, his back to her. His skin was pale, too pale, and something was missing. She stepped closer. He turned, and she saw it. His back was gone, flayed clean. No blood, no wounds, just emptiness, like the soul had stepped outside the flesh and left it behind. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. And then she woke up screaming. The wind was howling outside, scraping against the stones, but she could swear it had shape, it had rhythm, and it whispered a name. Not Ilro's, hers, Ansa. Again and again, in a voice like dry leaves, like brittle bone, like sorrow buried too long. Ansa, Ansa, Ansa. They buried Ilro at the edge of the woods, where the roots grow deep and tangled, and the light never fully reaches the ground. It was not where the others were buried. The village graveyard was a hill to the east, gentle and sunlit, a place of proper endings. But Ansa refused. "This is where he played," she said softly, standing over the shallow grave. "This is where he laughed." No one argued. No one came. Only Mirith stood beside her, her wrinkled hand resting on the wooden handle of her cane like a ritual staff. She brought with her a pouch of bone ash and poured a circle around the grave while murmuring under her breath. Ansa didn't watch. She stared at the dirt, and her hands wouldn't stop trembling. That night, Ansa sat by the hearth, clutching Ilro's worn tunic, the one with the little red fox stitched on the collar. She held it so tightly that her knuckles cracked. Her eyes were dry, too dry, as if her body had forgotten how to mourn. There were no more tears, just silence, until Mirith spoke. "They will come now," her mother said from the corner, where the shadows clung like old regrets. Ansa didn't turn. "Who?" "The ones who remember, the ones who never left." Ansa's breath caught. "You mean ghosts?" Mirith shook her head. "Older than ghosts, before Christ, before stone. They were here when our names were still spoken in dirt and blood. They know when a grief is big enough to eat, and they're always hungry." Ansa finally looked at her. Her face was pale, gaunt, but steady. "You speak of them as if they're real." Mirith did not blink. "They are. And if you speak to them, if you offer to them, they will answer." A silence stretched long and taut. Ansa said nothing. But in her heart, something shifted. Something ancient and wrong began to stir. The next night, the dreams returned. Ilro stood again near the altar, but this time he was facing her. His eyes were hollow, black pits filled with wind and whispering. He did not cry, he did not move, but something fluttered in his hands, a piece of skin, curled and yellowed like parchment. It had her name written on it, Ansa, written in the old runes, not the letters she knew, but the ones carved into the stones behind the altar, the ones the elders refused to teach. She reached for it. Ilro opened his mouth, and this time he screamed. Ansa jolted awake, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. Her back was burning, not in pain, but in heat, like something beneath the skin was trying to rise. She staggered to the mirror, turned around, lifted her shirt. Her skin was unbroken, but her name was faintly glowing just beneath the surface, like a tattoo inked with fire. 3 days passed. Then on the 4th, a strange thing happened. The village children stopped speaking, all of them. At first, the parents thought it was a game. Then fear crept in. The children simply stared, not blankly, but at Ansa's home. Some stood outside in the rain for hours, unmoving, eyes fixed on her shuttered windows. When questioned, they only whispered one word, Ansa. No one had taught them that name. No one had dared speak it out loud since the burial. On the 5th night, Mireth returned. She came alone, her back bent, her hands holding a rusted tin box sealed with wax. She sat across from Ansa, who had not eaten in 2 days. "There is a way," Mireth said. Ansa stared. "A way to speak to them, not with words, but with sacrifice, the old kind." Ansa didn't answer. She simply looked down at her arms. "I'll do it," she whispered. Her voice cracked. Mireth's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside were blades, thin, curved, carved with symbols. The bone handles were etched with runes that pulsed when touched, like they remembered what they'd done before. Ansa didn't flinch. Mireth said nothing more, only this: "You must not scream." That night, under the pale light of the waning moon, Ansa prepared. She boiled herbs, burned sage, painted her forehead with white clay. Her reflection in the cracked mirror no longer looked human. She looked like an offering. And in some way she was. She removed her tunic, turned her back towards the hearth, and sat on her knees, motionless. Mireth lit 3 candles, one for the soul, one for the body, one for the name. Then she began. The blade sang, skin parted like parchment. Blood did not flow, it hissed as if the air itself resisted the ritual. Ansa bit down on a cloth. She did not scream, not once. When it was done, she collapsed. Her back, now flayed, bled lightly as Mireth applied black salt and ash. She took the skin, still warm, and rolled it carefully. Then she wrapped it in red twine and kissed Ansa's forehead and whispered, "They will hear you now." At dawn, Mireth walked to the altar. The stones cracked beneath her steps, as though the ground itself remembered what was coming. She knelt. She dug with her bare hands until the dirt gave way to black soil, and she buried the skin. The wind stopped. The forest went silent, and from beneath the altar, something sighed. Back at the house, Ansa awoke. The fire was out. The room was dark, but her body no longer hurt. She stood slowly, unsteady, and moved toward the mirror. Her back was still raw, but the glowing name was gone. She smiled. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. But in the mirror, her reflection did not. Its eyes were weeping. Blood-red tears rolled down its cheeks, and its mouth, her mouth, moved in perfect silence, forming one word: run.
There is something unnatural about silence after a ritual. It is not peace, it is expectation. The kind of quiet that presses against the walls, seeps into the wood, and listens for breath. In the days following the burial of her skin, Ansa felt that silence everywhere. It crouched in corners, it pulsed in the floorboards, it breathed beside her pillow at night. She should have been healing, but instead the wound on her back remained raw, never bleeding, never scabbing, just open. Mireth said nothing. She kept to herself, watching,
muttering prayers in the old tongue. Ansa no longer dreamed of Ilro. She no longer dreamed at all. Only the wind visited her now, and it never came alone. On the 7th night, Ansa left the house. Wrapped in a heavy shawl and her own fever sweat, she walked through the frost-bitten paths toward the chapel ruins, the one the village had sealed generations ago, long before her birth. It sat in the crook of the mountain's shadow, choked by vines and moss, its roof collapsed, its doors rotted off the hinges. No one came here. No one was supposed to. Because beneath it lay the altar, the real one, not the cross-carved stone used by the converted, but the old slab buried underground, marked with spirals and runes no one dared read. This was where the skin prayer began, and where it always returned. She stepped carefully through the broken entrance. The air was cold, but dry, too dry for winter. Beneath her feet, the stone tiles shifted as if bones turned beneath them. She found the trapdoor near the altar's ruin, a wooden square sealed with iron hinges, nearly invisible under debris and time. She pulled. It opened easily, too easily. The stairs beneath descended into earth, into a darkness that swallowed even the moonlight. She didn't bring a lantern. She didn't need one. The altar was glowing. The underground chamber was smaller than she imagined, damp, cracked, walls carved with hundreds of names, overlapping, intertwined, some scratched out violently, others unfinished. The air smelled of salt, old blood, and earth that never saw the sun. At the center, a slab of black stone, curved like a rib, marked with dried stains that shimmered like oil. And just in front of it, a fresh mound of disturbed soil, where her skin had been buried. She stepped forward, her breath clouded, her hands trembled. And then she heard it, a sound beneath the stone, like whispering, but not in her ears, in her bones. The voices were many, old, cracked, worn thin by time. They didn't speak words exactly. They felt them. She offers. She mourns. She is open. She will carry. Ansa dropped to her knees, clutching her head. The voices pressed against her skull like iron bands tightening, forcing her to remember every scream, every sob, every second she had spent whispering Ilro's name into the dirt. But then, something else, a different voice, younger, closer, still full of sorrow. Mama? Her head snapped up, and there, above the altar, stood Ilro, naked, silent, eyes wide. His skin shimmered like smoke, barely real, but his face was exactly as she remembered. Ilro, she breathed, crawling forward, blood smearing on her knees. He opened his mouth, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was hers, and it was screaming. She awoke outside the ruins, face down in the dirt, mouth full of ash, nails broken, blood dried across her arms like ritual paint. Mireth was kneeling beside her. Her eyes were filled with fear. I told you not to go. They've seen you now. Ansa didn't speak. She couldn't. She simply stared up at the sky, now a dull, colorless gray, and she knew. The ritual had not ended. It had only begun. That evening, strange things began happening in the village. A newborn baby forgot how to cry. A well went dry, though it had never emptied in 70 years. 3 elders lost their voices, not in illness, but in silence, as if their words had been stolen from their tongues. And in the chapel ruins, the vines began to wither. One of the elders, Ruan, came to Mireth that night. His face was pale, his fingers stained with soot. "You told her, didn't you?" he hissed. "She volunteered. The gods don't take what is not given. She awakened it." Mireth turned away. It was already awake. It's just that now it has a name. That night, Ansa lay in bed, sweating, shaking, whispering her son's name like a lullaby to herself. But outside, in the wind, someone else was whispering it too, over and over. "Ilro, Ilro, Ilro." And then they began whispering hers. "Ansa," but not with love, with hunger. When the gods speak, they don't use words. They bleed into your breath. They live beneath your skin. They wait for you to open, and Ansa was wide open. The morning after her return from the altar, Ansa sat on the floor of her home with her back pressed against the cold stone wall. The wound had not healed. In fact, it no longer even felt like a wound, more like a mouth, always open, always breathing. Mireth stood over her, wringing her hands. "You need to rest," she said, but Ansa didn't move. The altar spoke. "Of course it did. You gave it flesh. It remembers now." Ansa's voice was hoarse. "It showed me Ilro." Mireth said nothing. "He called me Mama, but wasn't his voice. It was mine, like I was inside him." Still, Mireth said nothing. "What did I offer?" Ansa whispered. Her mother finally looked at her, and for the first time in days, she looked afraid. Everything. Later that day, the village bell rang. No one had touched it in years. Its rusted voice echoed through the stone homes and narrow paths like a call to something buried. People stepped outside. Mothers held their children close. Old men crossed themselves, once in the name of the Father, and once in the name of whatever came before. At the chapel ruins, the 3 remaining village elders stood in a line. Behind them, the vines had blackened, peeled away from the stone like dead skin. Elder Ruan stepped forward. His voice was loud, unshaking. "We have buried our grief for too long. We sealed the past. We turned our faces from the gods who made this mountain. But grief is not something you bury. It is something you pass on." The villagers stood silent. "We sealed the past because the pain of what we had done to survive was too much to bear. But the old gods did not forget that." He looked down the path toward the one figure approaching slowly, Ansa, barefoot, bandaged, broken, but walking. Ruan's eyes darkened. "She has volunteered, and the mountain has answered." The villagers did not cheer. They did not protest. They simply watched, because deep down they remembered. They remembered the stories of the woman who lost 4 sons to the river and walked into the altar alone, of the man whose wife was taken by fever, who cut his name from his skin and fed it to the fire, of the twin sisters who took turns bearing each other's sorrow until both forgot who they were. And now they would remember Ansa. The rite was prepared beneath the ruined chapel, in the underground chamber lit only by tallow candles and trembling hands. The altar had changed. It now pulsed faintly, as if it had a heart. The carvings along its base had spread like veins into the stone floor, and the soil where Ansa's skin was buried was no longer soil at all. It had become flesh, soft, pink, breathing. Ansa lay across the stone, arms outstretched. She did not cry. She did not tremble. Mirith stood at her feet, holding a clay bowl of salt and bone. Elder Ruan raised the blade. "Name the offering." Ansa's voice was steady. "My name is Ansa of Draylen. I offer my nameskin in grief, in devotion, in remembrance of Ilro, my only child." The blade hovered. "Do you come willingly?" "I come hollow. I have nothing left to lose." The blade sang. The first cut opened along the spine, the second across the shoulders. The chamber filled with the scent of iron and ash. The villagers, masked and silent, watched as the skin peeled free, inch by inch, each layer releasing a breath that did not belong to Ansa. The altar moaned, not loudly, softly, gratefully. When it was done, her skin, stained with sigils and sorrow, was folded carefully, placed into a linen wrap, and buried deeper this time, into a pocket of earth beneath the slab. Ansa remained on the altar, still, breathing, eyes open. That night, the wind did not howl. It sang, and every villager who heard it, every man, woman, and child, dreamed the same dream. A woman with no skin stood beneath the stars, arms wide, face lifted to the sky. She whispered their names, one by one, and as each name passed her lips, a weight lifted from their chests, a sorrow they didn't know they'd carried, and in its place, only her name remained. Ansa, Ansa, Ansa. When they awoke the next morning, something was missing. Not an object, not a memory, but a feeling. Their grief was gone. But Ansa's house was dark, and her shadow no longer moved with her.
The first thing Ansa noticed was the stillness. Not peace, not silence, but something colder. The absence of movement. She awoke in her home, though she didn't remember walking there. The hearth had burned low. The candles had melted to stumps. The air was dry, and the wound on her back pulsed faintly beneath the bandages, like it was still breathing on its own. Her skin was gone, her offering complete, but the grief had not left. Instead, it multiplied, it spread, it fed. At first, the changes were small. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair with trembling fingers. Her reflection blinked half a second late. She smiled weakly, but the reflection did not. It frowned, almost mournfully. Then, when she turned away, she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, her reflection remained, staring at her. The villagers began to change too. They smiled more easily, laughed more freely. A woman whose daughter drowned last winter was seen dancing near the market. An old man who hadn't spoken since his wife's death was telling jokes.
The grief that had climbed to the village like a second skin was gone, lifted. But something was wrong, because as their grief vanished, their memories followed. It began with names. A child forgot her sister's name. A man could not remember where his parents were buried. One woman walked into the chapel ruins and stared at the altar for hours, murmuring nonsense. When pulled away, she asked, "What's my name again? I think I lost it here." And still, each night, the wind whispered, "Ansa, Ansa, Ansa." Mireth came to her daughter's home in the early morning. She did not knock. She found Ansa sitting in the corner of the room, wrapped in a blanket, shivering, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that gnawed from within. "I don't feel right," she whispered. Mireth placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've taken it in," she said, "more than any of us expected, more than the gods ever asked. I thought I'd be empty, but I'm full, so full I can't move. I feel like everyone's pain is inside me, their sorrow, their memories, things I've never lived." Mireth nodded slowly. "Because that's what the prayer does," she whispered. "It doesn't remove grief, it relocates it." Ansa's breath caught in her throat. "They never told me that." Mireth looked away. No one ever tells the volunteer the truth. By the 5th day, the village no longer recognized her. When Ansa walked to the well, a group of children stared at her blankly. One boy reached out and touched her arm, and then he forgot his own name, collapsed into tears, sobbing the name Ansa over and over again like a mantra he didn't understand. More began to follow. People who brushed against her arm, walked in her shadow, heard her voice in passing. Each one slowly forgot themselves and began to remember her. Not her face, not her story, just her name. It became the only word that lingered in their minds. Ansa. Her name echoed in the well water. It whispered in the leaves. It wrote itself in frost across windows. It crawled into mouths and lingered behind teeth. And soon, the stones that lined the village path, the ones etched with the names of the dead, began to change. Some names faded, others rearranged, until at last, one morning, every stone bore a single word: Ansa. She ran to the chapel, her feet bloodied by sharp gravel. She tore open the trapdoor and descended into the altar chamber, and there, in the soft earth where her skin had been buried, a new growth had sprouted. Not flowers, not moss, but skin, new, pale, translucent, stretched over the soil like parchment. It bore her name etched over and over in spirals, as if the land itself were trying to remember her, or worse, become her. Ansa fell to her knees. She touched the growing skin. It was warm. It sighed. And from underneath, something moved. She screamed, not from fear, but from recognition. Because whatever was growing, whatever was moving beneath the surface, it was hers. Not Ilro, not the gods, not the village. It was her grief, given form, her grief now rooted. That night, the shadow in her home detached. She watched it step away from her feet and walk to the center of the room. It no longer copied her movements. It stood still, then turned to face her, and bowed, slowly, deeply, as if to acknowledge its new master, or its mother. Mirath came the next day. She looked into her daughter's eyes, and finally she said what should have been said from the beginning. The prayer was never mercy. It was a burden ritual. Grief must live somewhere. We thought burying it would seal it, but we were wrong. Then why do it? Answer whispered. Because someone always must, or it spreads without shape, becomes disease, war, madness. The skin prayer is the containment. Answer closed her eyes. I didn't end the pain, I just took it all in. Mirath nodded, tears running down her withered cheeks. You are now the grief of this place, the name no one forgets, the wound that keeps the rest of us whole. Outside, the villagers smiled, their burdens lifted, their minds light. They did not know why, but they all whispered one name as they passed the chapel. Ansa.
They called it a prayer, but now Ansa knew it was never a prayer, it was a contract. By the seventh night, the skin beneath the altar was no longer just growing, it was changing. What began as a sheet of flesh, stretched thin across the soil, had now curled upward, sprouting like a flower in bloom. Veins pulsed along its surface. Names written in half-formed runes rippled beneath its membrane like creatures swimming beneath ice. And at its center was a face, not fully formed, but hers. Ansa no longer left her home. There was no need. The village had already come to her, not in body, but in memory. She heard their thoughts at night, felt their dreams while she slept, cradled their sorrows like children in her arms. She woke with strange words in her mouth, songs she had never learned, names she had never known. She no longer remembered Ilro's face completely. When she closed her eyes, she saw dozens, hundreds, a child with a crooked tooth, a woman with smoke in her hair, a soldier screaming beneath fire. Were they hers? Had they ever been? Mirath came each evening to light candles and place salt at the door. She never stepped inside anymore. Why do they keep whispering my name? Ansa asked from the shadows one night. Mirath didn't answer right away. She only stared at the floor. Then she said softly, because it's the only one they still remember. That same night, Elder Ruin returned to the altar chamber. He brought with him an ancient scroll, long forbidden, wrapped in deer hide and sealed with wax. He broke the seal with shaking hands, unfurled the parchment, and read. The words were old, written in a tongue older than any still spoken. But he understood, because some things are inherited. The scroll told of the first name-bearer, a woman named Thirla, who flayed herself to contain a famine spirit that feasted on grief. She survived the ritual, but never spoke again. The villagers fed her herbs and salted meats, and in return, their fields flourished. But Thirla grew larger. Her shadow stretched across homes. Her back opened wider each season. Her eyes wept salt that killed the roots it touched, until finally she walked into the mountain and became the altar. The stone was her bones, the runes her skin. The altar was not where offerings were made, it was where they were buried. And Ansa was becoming the next one. Back in her home, Ansa sat by the fire, running her fingers over the old scars across her palms. They had begun to ache again. Not throb, not burn, ache, like something was pulling at her from the inside. She looked into the fire, and her reflection, warped in flame, smiled. But she was not smiling. Suddenly, the air changed. A sharp cold swept through the room. The candles died, and from the corner, her shadow stepped forward.
It no longer looked like her. It had grown. Its limbs longer, its spine curved wrong, its hands too large, and its face, still hers but stretched, opened its mouth. From it came names, thousands of them, all in her voice, all at once, and when it finished, it said only one word: empty. Answer collapsed, the sound of those names still ringing in her skull like bells submerged in blood. She curled into herself, trembling. "Am I still me?" she whispered out loud, and from the floorboards came an answer, a whisper: "No." The next morning, she walked barefoot to the altar. The villagers didn't stop her. Some bowed as she passed. Some turned away, suddenly unsure why they were weeping. A few followed her, silent, dazed. In the altar chamber, the skin had grown into a dome. Inside, things moved, limbs, eyes, teeth, all half-formed, all whispering. She knelt before it, and it pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and then opened. Not physically, not visibly, but spiritually. She felt herself stretch, felt the chamber fill with grief not her own, felt her soul flattened like parchment under the weight of thousands of memories. The altar was no longer stone, it was flesh, and it called her name, not in reverence, but in need. Later that night, Elder Ruin gathered the council. He placed the scroll on the table. He said this was not a healing rite. It was a containment, a redirection. She has become the vessel. She cannot hold it forever. One elder shook his head. Then what happens when she breaks? Ruin looked to the window, where her name had etched itself into the glass, and whispered, "Then the village breaks with her." That evening, as the villagers slept, Ansa stood in the doorway of her home, naked, bandaged, bleeding. The wind wrapped around her ankles like children. The trees whispered her name in 100 broken voices, and in the reflection of the village well, her face looked back, wearing someone else's eyes. Every village has its secrets, but in Draylen, secrets are not hidden. They are buried, under stone, under silence, under generations of ritual wrapped in the language of faith. Elder Ruan had not spoken to the gods in many years, not since the last volunteer. Her name had been Veril. She had lost her husband and 2 sons in a fire that took half the northern ridge. She was quiet, gentle, willing. She was told it would ease her pain, that the skin prayer would offer her peace, that it was a sacred burden, a noble gift. Ruin was a young man then. He watched as her back was carved open. He helped bury the skin. He recited the words from the same scroll that now sat open on his table, stained with time and guilt. But what they told Veril was a lie. She did not find peace. She went mad. Within a month, she had sewn shut her mouth with hawthorn thorns and set fire to her own shadow. By spring, she was dead, and no one spoke of her again. Not even her name was carved in stone. Because the ritual hadn't healed her, it had simply moved the pain somewhere else. Ruin looked at the flames now, remembering. They had buried that truth. They had told themselves it was the gods' will. But now, watching Ansa walk among the villagers like a living monument, her name replacing every other, he saw it clearly. The ritual was not holy. It was cruel, and it was spreading.
The children were the first to change. They stopped answering to their own names. They sat in circles, tracing symbols in the dirt, spirals, eyes, blades. One girl carved a word into her leg with a sewing needle. Ansa. Adults fared no better. They spoke with blank faces, their voices flat, their memories thin. A man walked into the market and forgot why he was there. A woman forgot she had ever been pregnant. A mother, eyes hollow, handed her baby to Ansa without a word, and Ansa took it, held it, rocked it, whispered a lullaby in a language no one taught her, then gave it back, and the mother wept with joy, though she no longer remembered the child's name. It wasn't possession, it was absorption. She was becoming a conduit. Grief flowed through her, but something else stayed behind. Names, faces, weight. Elder Ruan gathered the others beneath the chapel in secret. Mirith came too, slower now, more sunken. They stood around the altar, staring at the skin flower pulsing at its center. It had grown taller, more human-shaped. It breathed. Ruan opened the scroll again. This is no longer a vessel, it's a root system. Our sorrow flows through her into the soil, but she's not just carrying it anymore. She's feeding on it, or being fed to it. Another elder whispered, "So we end the ritual. We dig up the skin, burn it." Mirith's voice cut through like a blade. "No, she's gone too far. The altar has accepted her. If you burn it now, it won't kill the grief, it'll release it." The elders fell silent. "So what do we do?" one asked. Mirith looked at the stone and said, "You lie again." That evening, the village bell rang once, not by hand. No one had touched it. It rang on its own. And from every doorway, the villagers stepped out, not confused, not dazed, but drawn to the chapel, to the altar, to her. Ansa stood at the threshold of the ruins, barefoot, eyes empty, lips slightly parted as if mid-prayer. Children stood beside her, women behind her, men just beyond. None of them spoke. Not a single one remembered why they were there, but all of them remembered one word: Ansa. The altar chamber welcomed them. The air was warmer now, grieving. Ansa stepped forward, and the skin flower opened like a shrine. Inside, a hollow, just big enough for her. She stepped in, and for the first time since Ilro's death, she smiled. Elder Ruan watched from the shadows. His mouth trembled. He wanted to call out, to stop her, but he knew it was too late. This was not a moment of madness. It was completion. She was becoming the next altar, not stone, but flesh. Ansa, the new vessel of grief, her name the last the village would ever need. Ruan turned away, and as he stepped back into the light, he whispered the words Mirith had spoken decades ago, the ones meant only for the keepers of the old rite. Let her bear what we bury. Let her carry what we forget. He closed his eyes and said the final line, so the rest may live without sorrow. By the next full moon, no one remembered the child named Ilro. Not his face, not his voice, not even the grief that once followed his name like a funeral bell. His mother still walked the village paths, her shadow still followed the wind, but her name no longer belonged to just her. It belonged to everyone. And so the forgetting began. It was subtle at first. A wife forgot the tune her husband used to hum before bed. A child forgot what his father looked like. Then it deepened. A woman held her mother's hand at dusk and asked, "Have we met before?" A man knelt before a stone etched with his own name and whispered, "Who are you?" The blacksmith stared at the flames in his forge for hours, then asked aloud, "What is it I make?" And through it all, the name Ansa spread like salt through water, unseen but unmistakable. In the village center, children played a new game. They stood in a circle and whispered names one by one. Each name said aloud would vanish. The child would forget it, erase it, until only one name remained, and they would all speak it in unison. Ansa. They didn't know why, but they never smiled when they said it. In her home, Ansa sat by the window. She no longer felt hunger, or exhaustion, or time. She simply existed. The skin on her back had hardened, not into scar, not into flesh, but stone, etched with faint lines, names, some familiar, others from centuries past, a map of grief carved into her body. Her reflection did not speak anymore. It wept, constantly, endlessly, even when she smiled. Mirith came less often now. She aged quickly, as if her own name had begun to fade. One morning, she stood at the threshold of Ansa's home and stared for a long time. Finally, she said, "I had a daughter once." Ansa looked up slowly. "You still do." Mirith blinked. Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't remember her name." Ansa nodded. "You buried it." Beneath the chapel, the altar bloomed fully. Its skin no longer pink, but pale white. Flesh turned bone. Its roots had split the floor, reached through the mountain's veins. The chamber echoed constantly now, not with voice, but with breath, as if the mountain itself had lungs. And it whispered things no one could translate, syllables scraped from old prayers, from languages spoken by things with no mouths. Elder Ruin returned, alone. He came not with scrolls or blades, but with questions. And a stone, a name stone. It bore no inscription, just a blank surface where once had been his father's name. He knelt before the altar. "You've taken too much. We were never meant to forget this much." The altar pulsed in reply. Once, twice. Then a name appeared on the stone in his hand. But it wasn't his father's. It was Ansa. Ruin wept. For the first time in 40 years he wept, and in the silence he realized the ritual had worked too well. It had turned a prayer into a sinkhole. A ritual meant to hold grief had become one that consumed identity.
And now there was only one memory left, only one name: the vessel, the wound, the skin. Ansa. Later that night, the villagers gathered around the chapel again, but this time not in silence. They hummed a strange, low melody, a mourning tune no one remembered learning. Their eyes were blank, their mouths moved in unison, and inside the altar chamber, Ansa stood beneath the dome of growing skin. She placed her hand against its center, and it opened, not like a door, but like an eye. And from within came a sound, a single voice, not hers, but made of her. It said, "You are the root, they are the bloom. Their pain is your shape, their forgetting is your name." And with that, Ansa understood. She was no longer grieving. She was grief itself, the shape it had chosen, the mouth it had grown, and the silence it had become. Far across the valley, in a neighboring village, a child woke screaming. When his mother asked what was wrong, he simply whispered, "I saw a woman with no skin." The mother hushed him gently. It was just a dream. But as she comforted him, she noticed her own name had slipped her mind, just for a moment, just long enough to wonder if she'd ever really had one.
Grief is not a visitor. It is not a thing that comes and goes. It is a tenant. And when you give it space, when you give it a name, it unpacks its things and stays. Ansa had not moved in 3 days. Her body sat still in the center of her home, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak, she didn't sleep, she simply stared at the door, as if waiting for something to enter. But it was already inside. Her shadow had changed. It no longer followed the light, it no longer mimicked her. It walked freely, with purpose. It climbed the walls when she lay still. It crept across the ceiling when she closed her eyes. And sometimes, in the earliest hours of morning, it would stand over her, watching, smiling, weeping. Mirith came one last time. Her hair now fully white, her voice no more than a breath. She stepped through the door and stopped short. Ansa was not alone. Her shadow sat beside her, holding her hand. It looked like her, but it was longer, thinner, its mouth wider, its eyes hollowed like a mask carved from sorrow. Mirith's lips trembled. "You've let it out." Ansa blinked slowly. "No," she said. "I am letting it become." That night, it left the house, the shadow. It stepped into the village without a sound, without a shape of its own, and it moved through people. Not around them, through. And every villager it passed, every man, woman, and child, paused. Their eyes rolled back, their mouths opened, and when the shadow stepped on, they would speak. A single line: "My name is Ansa." By morning, not a single villager remembered who they were, only that they had once mourned something. But now they didn't need to, because she carried it all. In the chapel ruins, the altar had split. Its skin flower had bloomed fully, revealing a dark hollow beneath, pulsing, beating, whispering in 100 overlapping voices.
It was no longer a place of offering. It was a mouth, and it hungered, not for blood, but for identity. Elder Ruan came to the threshold alone. He held in his hands a relic never meant to be used, a polished obsidian shard from the original altar, passed down through the keepers of the rite. A final measure, a tool for ending. He stepped into the chamber and saw her, Ansa, standing in the center of the hollow, her eyes black as the void, her skin pale as bone, and her shadow was gone, because it was no longer separate. It was within her, fused, alive. Ansa, he whispered, but she did not turn. I know what they told you, about what this ritual was, about what you were meant to carry. She closed her eyes. A single tear slid down her cheek. It was never meant to end grief, she said. No, he admitted. It was meant to store it. To hide it, she replied. To delay it, he said. To feed it, she corrected. And then she looked at him, eyes full of every funeral the village had ever wept, every name ever carved, every sorrow ever silenced. Do you want it back? She asked. Ruan dropped the shard. It shattered against the floor, and he fell to his knees, because in that moment he remembered everything. His wife's death, his mother's screams, the smell of burnt hair from the fire that took his brother, the shame he buried, the choices he made. He remembered Veril, her eyes when they lied to her, the day she walked into the altar chamber believing she would find peace. And he wept, because now it was all back. Every buried grief, every silenced name, it had returned. Ansa stepped forward. She touched his forehead and whispered, "Thank you," then turned and walked into the hollow beneath the altar. Her body vanished into the roots, her skin peeled gently into the walls. Her name carved itself in bone across the dome, and her shadow slid up the altar and stretched across the entire chamber. It pulsed, then disappeared. By dawn, the village was quiet, too quiet. No children laughed, no birds sang, but no one wept either. They did not know who they were. They did not know what they'd lost, but the wind still whispered. It whispered a name, not shouted, not cried, just breathed into the trees and soil like a lullaby. Ansa.
Some things, once planted, cannot be uprooted. The altar had bloomed, the shadow had fused, the names were gone. But Elder Ruan was not ready to accept what the others now walked through like fog. The ritual had become permanent, and the village no longer mourned because they no longer remembered. They had traded grief for amnesia, pain for peace. But Ruan remembered everything. Because he had spoken to her, because he had seen her, not just the vessel, not just the altar, but the woman still buried inside, Ansa. And somewhere, beneath the stone, beneath the skin, beneath the layers of names, she was still grieving, still human, still reachable. So Ruan began searching, not in books, not in scrolls, but in memory, the only place still haunted. He descended into the hollow beneath the chapel and spent 3 days in the dark, fasting, listening. And on the fourth day, he heard it, a voice, soft, choked, hers. I remember him. That was all she said, but it was enough, because that meant Ansa still held on to Ilro, the boy who died, the grief that started it all. Everything else was borrowed, given, forced upon her, but Ilro was hers, which meant there was still a root that hadn't been devoured. The ritual of reversal had no written form, no instructions, only myth. But Ruin pieced it together from fragments of old hymns, carvings half buried in the floorboards of the old chapel, and stories told by dying grandmothers who barely remembered their own names. To reverse the skin prayer, one would have to take back the grief, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally. Someone would have to flay themselves in Ansa's name, bury their own skin beneath her, and speak the original grief aloud, word for word, name for name, sorrow for sorrow. It wasn't about undoing the ritual. It was about pulling her out, like yanking a root from sacred ground, like bleeding memory back into the village. But there was one condition. It had to be done willingly. And no one volunteered. The villagers, now hollow-eyed and peaceful, had no pain left to give. They smiled when asked, shrugged when pressed. "What sorrow?" they would say. Or worse, "What's a name?" Ruin stood beneath the old bell tower, a blade in hand, and spoke into the gathering dusk. "I will do it," he said. The wind did not stir. No one came, not even Mireth, who had not been seen in days. Ruin raised the blade, caught a thin line down his left arm, then his right. He laid himself upon the chapel floor, and for the first time in decades, he spoke a name aloud. Veril, the woman they had sacrificed before Ansa, the woman they erased. Veril of the Eastern Ridge, wife of Darren, mother of the twins Jewel and Bran. She was promised peace, she was given a lie. I remember for her. He bled into the soil, and it drank. The wind stirred, the altar pulsed, and far below, in the chamber where flesh grew like vines, a sound emerged. Not a scream, not a cry, but a crack. Stone shifting, skin pulling apart, and from the hollow, a single voice. Ilro. Ruin's eyes widened. "She's coming back," he whispered. But the altar resisted. It had grown strong, rooted not in blood, but in forgetting. The soil writhed, the bones groaned, the chapel walls began to sweat, and then Ansa emerged. Slowly, horribly. From the hollow, her body crawled upward, not broken, but half-formed, her back still open, her face carved with names that glowed faintly. But her eyes were hers. Not empty, not borrowed, hers. She collapsed onto the stone. Ruin crawled to her side and asked, "Do you remember him?" She turned her head slowly and whispered, "His name was Ilro." Ruin wept. because that meant the ritual hadn't consumed her entirely. A seed of truth had survived, and in that moment, a choice could still be made. He lifted the blade again, this time not in offering, but in warning. To end this, someone must carry it. Unsa's voice was barely a breath. "I've carried too much." Ruin nodded, then placed the blade to his chest. "I will take it back." Unsa reached out weakly and touched his hand. "No," she said. "You remember. You regret. But I refuse to forget." And with a final breath, she plunged it into her own heart. The altar screamed, the chapel shook, the skin flower burned from within, and the names carved into her spine ignited, one by one, until there was only Ilro, and then nothing. When Ruin awoke, the altar was gone, the hollow was empty, the chapel still. And outside, the villagers were waking, confused, dazed, their memories returning like a slow, painful dawn. A mother remembered her child's funeral. A man wept for the wife he had forgotten. And every one of them, without knowing why, whispered a name under their breath. Unsa. They found her body beneath the chapel, folded into the roots, hands clasped over her heart. Peaceful, human, no longer a vessel, no longer a wound, just a mother who had remembered. The wind had stopped. For the first time in living memory, the cliffs above Draylen stood silent. No names whispered through the pines, no voices echoed across the stone, no grief crawled across the rooftops at night. And yet, no one celebrated, because now they remembered. They remembered the things they had buried, the child who drowned while chasing butterflies, the lover lost to sickness and soot, the grandfather who took his own life, and the silence that followed. They remembered all the names they had carved, then abandoned. They remembered Unsa and what they had done. Mirth came down from the mountain. Her eyes were sunken, her legs barely held her, but she walked with purpose. To the chapel, to the altar, to her daughter's resting place. And there, where roots had once pulsed with stolen sorrow, she found her, still, folded in sleep, as if death had come not to end her, but to return her. Mirth sat beside the body. She touched Unsa's cheek with trembling fingers and spoke softly, not to the gods, not to the village, but to the woman who had carried what no one else would. "I remember your name," she said, "and I will speak it so no one ever forgets again." And for the first time in many lifetimes, an elder prayed not to be released from grief, but to be worthy of it. Far beneath the chapel, where the altar once lived, a new shape had begun to take root. Not skin, not shadow, but stone, carved not by blade, but by memory. A monument, not to a god, but to a woman, a mother, a vessel, the mother of all names. Her name etched deep into its core, Unsa. Below it, in smaller lettering, she remembered when no one else would. And then the stories began. Not immediately. At first, only whispers, but they grew.
Children born after her death would ask their parents, "Who was Ansa? Why do we say her name before we speak the names of the dead?" And their parents would answer, "She was the first who did not run. She was the one who carried us. She is the reason we remember." And slowly, the ritual changed. No longer a flaying, no longer a sacrifice, but a remembrance. Every spring, the village would gather around the stone at dawn, and one by one, they would step forward and say a name. Not their own, not Ansa's, but a name they feared the world had forgotten. A brother, a friend, a stillborn child, a woman who sang lullabies in a war-torn kitchen, a man who carved birds out of driftwood and left them on windowsills. Every name given was carved into the stone beside Ansa's, and with each name spoken aloud, the wind picked up softly and carried the memory through the trees. The mountain, once a place of silence and sorrow, became a place of stories, and the people of Draylen learned something they had forgotten long ago: that grief is not a curse, it is a testament to love, to memory, to what matters. And yet, far across the valley, in a place untouched by Draylen's rites, a child awoke screaming. The mother rushed in, held her tight, asked what was wrong, and the girl whispered, "I saw her." "Who, love?" "The woman with no skin." The mother froze, tried to soothe her, told her it was only a dream. But later that night, when the wind rose, it spoke a name through the trees, a name no one in that village had ever known. Ansa. Because grief doesn't die. It travels, it waits, and when it finds a willing vessel, it whispers.
In Draylen, the moon is more than a light in the sky. It is a witness. It sees what the people forget. It keeps the names the village lets go. And once each season, when it turns blood red and hangs low over the chapel ruins, they say it begins to harvest. The harvesting moon rose 1 year after Ansa's death. It came quietly, without prophecy or warning, but the villagers knew. They felt it in their bones, in the way their shadows stretched longer than their bodies, in the way the air refused to carry sound no matter how loudly they spoke, in the way no one could remember what dream had woken them the night before. Mireth was the first to return to the chapel. She had grown thin, her hands shaking from age, but her eyes were clear. She stood before Ansa's stone and spoke. "I remember." Behind her, others gathered, one by one, each with a name, each with a story, each with a sorrow they had dared to carry. And for a while, it seemed like the ritual had changed forever, until the wind began to circle. Not blow, not howl, but circle round and round the gathering like a noose tightening, and with it came a sound no one had heard since the old days, a sigh from the soil. The ground beneath the altar cracked. The names carved into the stone began to glow faintly, not with light, but with heat, and in the wind something began to speak, not in words, not in runes, but in names. All the names Ansa had ever absorbed, hundreds of them, thousands,
whispered in a spiral until finally they formed a shape, a voice. Hers. "You left me buried too long." The stone split open. From its center rose a new figure, not Anza, but something grown from her. Tall, shapeless, wrapped in living skin etched with moving text. The face was featureless, a blank canvas where mouths opened and closed in silent grief. It stepped forward. The villagers trembled. Some knelt, others wept. But no one ran, because deep down they knew. They had remembered the names, but not the burden. The harvesting moon turned deeper red. The sky dimmed, and the figure spoke. "You took comfort in remembering, but you gave me nowhere to put the pain." Mireth stepped forward, tears running down her face. She opened her arms. "I am here," she whispered. "I will carry it this time." The figure tilted its head, then placed a hand on her chest. Mireth gasped, collapsed, and when she hit the ground, her body crumbled into salt. Silence fell. The figure turned to the villagers, lifted a hand, but this time no one screamed. They stepped forward together, offered names, memories, tears, willingly, not to forget, but to carry as Anza once had. And for each offering, the figure grew smaller, less distinct, its shape dimming, until finally there was nothing left but a single line burned into the altar stone. Pain is not a curse, only forgetting is. The harvesting moon faded, the wind stilled, and the chapel stood whole once more, stone, still, sacred. That night, in every home, someone wept, but not from sorrow, from memory. Real, heavy, human memory, the kind Anza had carried alone for too long, and now, at last, was shared. But far beyond the cliffs of Dralen, in a forest no map named, a boy wandered off during a storm. He followed a sound, a whisper in the trees, a name repeating again and again. He found no house, no light, only a stone buried in moss, and carved into its face was a single word: Anza.
There are places where silence is peaceful, and then there are places where silence is a tomb. In Dralen, silence was never quiet. It was filled with everything no one dared say, everything no one dared remember, everything they buried beneath prayers and polite smiles. And now, that silence was cracking open. The harvesting moon had passed. The figure, born from Ansa's sacrifice, had vanished into ash and wind. But the village was not free. It was simply exposed. Because without the altar to hold the pain, without the vessel to carry it, the grief began to return, unfiltered, uncontained. And for the first time in generations, the villagers were forced to feel everything. They remembered the names, but now they remembered the weight behind them. They remembered the screams that came with death, the sound of wet soil on small coffins, the nights they drank until faces blurred, the mornings they stared at knives too long. They remembered every unanswered prayer, every door they didn't knock on, every wound they left for someone else to carry. And most of all, they remembered how they treated Ansa,
how willingly they let her become the skin between them and their sorrow. How easily they looked away as she unraveled. How quickly they praised her when she was gone. A woman named Lyris was the first to speak it aloud. She stood in the center of the market square with her hands bloodied from clawing at the old chapel door, sobbing. I gave her my son. I handed him to her when I couldn't hold the grief anymore. I watched her take him, and I felt relief. The villagers stood still. No one denied her, because they had all done the same. Elder Ruan had aged a decade in days. He barely spoke. He spent hours kneeling before Ansa's cracked stone, running his hands across the etched names, not to read them, but to feel the grooves, to remember they were real, that once someone's pain was carved deep enough to last beyond death. One evening, a child asked him, "Why didn't anyone stop it?" And he had no answer, only a whisper, because it was easier to be quiet. Mirith's home stood empty now. A thin trail of salt still marked the threshold where her body had dissolved. But inside, they found something no one expected. Dozens of folded pages, memories, letters, drawings, names. Every person Mirith had ever known, every sorrow she had ever seen, written in careful, trembling script, not for herself, but for Ansa. One note, left unsealed, sat on the table. If I forget her, she carries it. If I remember, I carry it. So I will carry it, because she carried me. That note was copied, etched into the stone wall of the chapel, spoken aloud every spring at the remembrance gathering. And slowly, pain became part of the ritual again, not to be buried, not to be avoided, but to be acknowledged. And still, the wind carried her name, but now it came not as a whisper, but as a song, low, gentle, something between a lullaby and a lament, the voice of someone who never left, not to haunt, but to remind, because the price of silence is never paid in screams, it is paid in forgotten names, in empty gravestones, in eyes that do not cry when they should. In one home, a man lit a candle for his mother. He spoke her name aloud, then his father's, then his brother's, then Ansa's. And when the candle flickered, he smiled, because he knew he was not alone. But far across the sea, in a city of metal and smoke, a woman stepped onto a train platform. She looked around and suddenly froze, not in fear, but confusion. She couldn't remember where she was going, or why she was crying, but a name echoed in her mind, soft, uninvited, unshakable. Ansa. Because memory doesn't end with place, or time, or death. It lives in stories, in silence, in songs carried by the wind. And when we try to bury it, it finds its way back. Always. It began with the wind. It always does. A whisper through pine, a name in the fog, a presence in the stillness that makes you pause without knowing why. The village of Drawlin still stands, smaller now, quieter, but the chapel remains, the altar remains, and her name remains. Etched in stone, etched in memory, etched in bloodlines and bedtime stories. Ansa. The villagers no longer bury their grief. They speak it. They sing it. Each spring they gather with stones in their hands, each stone bearing a name, not their own, but someone they've lost or someone they remember only faintly. They place these stones around the altar, not to forget, but to acknowledge. And before they leave, they each whisper her name once, to thank her, to promise they'll carry their own sorrow, to promise they'll never force someone else to wear their shadow again. But not all promises last forever. A traveler once came to Drawlin, young, curious, unaware. He had heard rumors of the chapel, a strange place of beauty and bone, of rituals and remembrance. He wanted to see the altar for himself. He walked the path at dusk, alone. He carried no stone, no name, only a question. The chapel welcomed him, as it always does. The wind was still. The walls breathed faintly. And in the center of the stone floor, he found the monument. Simple, elegant, etched with hundreds of names, circling one word at the center. Ansa. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without knowing why, he reached out, touched the name, and the moment he did, he remembered. Not his grief, not his story, but hers. Ilro's face, the flaying, the altar pulsing, the skin flower blooming, the shadow walking on its own. 1,000 moments, not his, now pouring into his mind like rain into dry soil. He fell to his knees, eyes wide, mouth open, and he whispered, "She didn't forget." When he left the chapel, he carried something with him. Not a curse, not a demon, but a memory. One that was never his, but now lived inside him. And wherever he walked after that, no matter how far he traveled, people would occasionally ask him, "What's your name again?" And every time he would pause, just for a breath, because he wasn't always sure anymore. Elsewhere, in a village far beyond the cliffs, a child was born. She had no voice for 3 years. The doctors were worried, the parents confused. But one night, as the wind howled across the mountains and rattled the shutters, she opened her mouth and said a single word, "Ansa." The parents asked who taught her. She shook her head and said, very softly, "She's under the stone." The skin prayer was never erased. It was never destroyed, because rituals do not need worship to survive, only memory, only names. And somewhere in the places where grief goes unspoken, where names go uncarved, where silence grows too heavy to bear, the altar waits, still pulsing, still whispering, still remembering. So if you ever feel a chill on your back at night, if the wind says a name you've never heard, if your reflection weeps when you smile, don't look away. Don't pretend you didn't hear it. Don't bury it. Because someone once carried sorrow for all of us, and her name must never be forgotten. Her name was Ansa.